Hey, Nick with CC Minis here, and today we're going to get your Spearhead terrain painted fast. I'm going to show you how I painted my set in about 3.5 hours, so you can get yours knocked out in a night or two and get back to playing some Spearhead in style. Let's do this. We'll start with the terrain primed gray. First step is to start dry brushing on a brighter gray just about everywhere on these pieces of terrain. For this first coat, it's okay to be a bit sloppy in the paint application. I'm going for more of an overbrush here to quickly establish the lighter tones. Instead of removing most of the paint from the dry brush, I simply dab the brush into the paint, massage the paint a bit into the bristles by dabbing the brush on paper a few times or doing a little swirly-dirly, and use this mostly still loaded brush to scrub and dab at the terrain, focusing mostly on the brick textures, and brushing quickly side to side against the grain of the wooden boards to catch the grain texture. I worked my way across these models, hitting just about everywhere except for the metal bits, which I want to stay dark for now. As the paint starts to dry, don't be afraid to go back and hit sections again. I focused on the centers of the panels between these columns because it kind of just felt right, and the very tops of these because those would definitely be hit by light the most. All in, the first and second passes of bright warm gray took about 15 minutes to complete before moving on to our next color, heavy warm white. This color was also thickly dry brushed all around, but this time focusing more on the center of where the first dry brushing step was applied, brightening these areas even more, but letting the edges of the areas remain a darker tone, basically leaving shadows in the recesses next to the columns. On the two smaller pieces of terrain, this was used as well, primarily focusing on the top 3/4 of the models and letting any dark spots that looked like cool shadows remain. Make sure you make these fires nice and bright. It'll be very helpful later on. And to make them and the rest of these models brighter, we're going to bring out some titanium white paint, also dry brushing. The white was dry brushed more selectively, only hitting the details I wanted to accentuate, and the very centers of the gray gradients we've been building up to. Total time spent dry brushing was about 50 minutes. And gives us the basis of the bright off-white stone walls and a fantastic underpainting to work with for nearly everything else on these models. To capitalize on that underpainting, we're going to use some speed paints from Army Painter. You could use contrast or any other slap chopper proof paints for this, by the way. Brand isn't really important, just how the paint can be applied. The first color was a nice dark chocolatey brown called Dark Wood. We're going to use this to base coat all the metal bits around the model. This includes the bronze trim found on 2 of the sets of walls, this big old bell, any little chains dangling hither and thither, scaveny metal panels and machinery, and finally all the gold parts on the toppled Stormcast statue. One thing that helped me out a lot during this step was to use the photos from the GW websites as reference to make sure I got all the right bits covered. Even with that help though, the step was a long one, clocking in at nearly an hour, 56 minutes. That's okay though, this will be the longest step by far. Now that we were done with the dark wood speed paint, it's time to tackle the wood. I put a handful of browns onto my palette and started to apply them all over the wood bits across the terrain. Instead of doing just one color on these, I went ahead and mixed and matched all the browns around, not being afraid to let the colors swirl and bleed into one another on the model. I try to keep the centers reserved for a more saturated bright orangish brown with gradients into the darker wood at the edges. But this wasn't a hard and fast rule at all. Hats off to whoever sculpted this wood texture, by the way. It takes speed paints perfectly. Just look at that contrast. All in, the wood bits took less than 10 minutes to complete, but golly gee willikers, was that a satisfying 10 minutes. Now we're on to some of the smaller bits around the model. There are 3 skeletons hanging around the wall pieces, and each of those got a slathering of pallid bone, along with all the ubiquitous skulls around this blatantly GW terrain. The 2 smaller bits of terrain have some earth and rocky textures at the bottom, which was hit with a dark gray. A random pod got hit with a brown still on the palette from the wood step, same with this little keychain, and everything else hiding in these wall nooks. Next up is the flame bits. I used one of my favorite speed paint colors, prismatic blue, near the center of the fire, then added in some yellow to that blue and wet blended this concoction in with the blue, making the flames greener and slightly darker as they got further away from the center of the fire. This green concoction was then applied to some of the warpstone on one of the walls. These little bits added up to a whopping 14 minutes and change, bringing us to a little over 2 hours on the project so far. With everything else base coated on these models, it's time to bring out the metallics. First of which will be some bronze. I'm using Pro Acrylic Bronze here because I'm a huge fan of its deep bronzy tone. This was applied to the wall trim, the bells, and any scaveny pipes and machinery. Next, I brought out a mid-tone silver color and dry brushed that on everything that I wanted to be more of a steely metal. This included any metal paneling, all the chains around the model, door trim, and a few of the pipes and these things under the warp crystals. Next up was some gold, which was applied to the fallen Stormcast statue, the door trim on one of the walls, and this goblet, which definitely is still here for some reason. All in, the metallics took a little more than a half hour to apply, 37 minutes. With that, we have all of our base coats on the model done, and we can bring out a nice unifying wash. Now I want the bright white stones to stay nice and bright, so I watered down my wash like a Long Island iced tea at the Canopy Club in Urbana, about 1-to-1 wash to water. I realize that there are only about 4 of you that are going to understand that joke, and that's totally fine. Let me know if you've seen The Piano Man in the comments below. It's a good time. This wash was applied everywhere except for the green flames. The extra watery wetness lets the wash slip into the cracks with little effort, but thinning down your washes this much has a major drawback: severe coffee staining. So I removed some of the excess wash from the larger surfaces while it was still wet with a makeup sponge. This helps us combat those coffee stains and keeps the white rocks nice and bright. The wash took a little more than 15 minutes, but oh boy, did it have a huge impact on this terrain set. After the wash dried, the fallen statue's gold still felt a little too flat, so I used some hardened leather speed paint to add in some dimension. This was glazed on to where I wanted some deeper, fuller shadows. On the shoulder pads, I added some around the trim, then used a wet brush to feather out the paint, creating a super easy gradient. This paint was also used to add some dimension to the gold door trim. For this, I tried my best to paint only the center of the trim, letting the edges remain a bit brighter, kind of like some free edge highlights. Another downside of the overall wash we did earlier is it dulls down the metallics. To fix this, I brought out some chrome paint and lightly dry brushed over all the metallic bits around the terrain. I used a small makeup brush here and tried my best not to hit any of the non-metallic bits across the models. This was another super high impact, low effort step, adding a boatload of dimension to the metallics and only 10 minutes to the project. The official GW Paint Shops has this wonderful bluish patina around the bronze bits. Let's try to recreate that with some turquoise paints. If you don't have turquoise paint, you can easily make your own by just adding a drop or two of green to some blue paint. It'll be close enough. This was mixed about 1-to-1 with water, giving it a very loose, flowy wash-like consistency. I applied it everywhere that there was bronze, but not all over. Just a little bit here and there where I felt like a little blue would look cool, or the bronze was looking a little too flat. Almost done now, it's time to put the finishing touches on some super small details. I took out a bright yellow-green color to highlight the green flames in the warpstone crystals, giving them a much-needed punch of saturation. Then a cool bluish off-white was used to highlight the bluer portions of the flames. Again, you don't need this exact color, you could easily add a bit of blue to some white. You'll be fine. Last step of the project is tackling the scaveny symbol that looks like it was sandblasted into the wall. I wanted this to be dark and slightly green, so I used a dark green speed paint, and simply let the paint flow into the recesses, being careful not to hit any of those edges. This was kind of like playing a less intense game of Operation. And with that, we are done with the painting. I edited some magnets to these using some green stuff stuck to the bottom of the 2 smaller bits with magnets smushed in there using a flat surface of a table to make sure it was all level. For the walls, I ended up drilling in the correct size holes and then sinking the magnets into them. I added these so I can carry them around in this little army case that a company called Famard sent out to me to try. Full disclosure, they didn't sponsor this video, but they did send this to me for free. It's large enough to fit any of the Spearhead forces and terrain with ease. It's even big enough to carry around my full 2,000 point Tomb King flavored Soulblight army. I really like the fact that it's made out of clear plexiglass instead of, opaque materials. I really enjoy being able to actually see what's in the box. It's a nice touch. If you want to check that out, I'll put a link to it down in the description below. Amazon affiliate link, you don't pay more, I get a small commission, you know the drill. I am super happy with how this set of terrain turned out, and I was pleasantly surprised with how fun painting GW terrain was. This is the first time I've actually ever painted terrain from GW, and it was a blast. I don't think I would have ever tried it if it didn't come in the Scaventide box, but it was super fun, so I think I'll end up trying more in the future. All in, this terrain took about 3.5 hours, and I can't wait to start getting some games in with it. That was some fast terrain, but if you're looking for a way to paint models even faster, you can check out this video right here. Huge shout out to my patrons for making videos like this possible. I really appreciate you guys. Until next time, stay happy and take care. Bye-bye.